Mr. Heaivilin, be talking today about multi-hazard food security, some of the framework development surrounding it, and potential applications thereof. So really quickly, this sort of stems from an interest in food security and sort of arising issues surrounding it, mostly related to rapid urbanization and its modifications on consumption patterns, the transition from agriculture to essentially having increased production yielding from intensification as opposed to extensification. Narrowing of crop selections, mostly being optimized for export, and hazard and climate change's potential impacts on food security and production overall. So essentially all of those things having the possibility of contributing to situations like this, where you end up with no food on the shelves or in the markets or what have you, or in many cases just not having markets at all. So we're considering sort of the biogeophysical constraints of food production, those being the hazards, climatic adaptability, urbanization, not so much in the context of taking agricultural land, but in the way that urban dwellers' patterns of consumption are generally shifted towards increasing different sort of palettes, if you will, and generally that the increase of meat consumption and waste production have broader negative impacts that can also impact agriculture that sort of come to this nexus of energy, agriculture, and health. So from that, working to achieve sort of what I've termed as a multi-hazard food security, which involves diversified production systems that are climate adaptive, have low energy requirements, are derived from baseline nutrient needs, and are sort of disaster aware in that they're designed for hazards that are sort of endemic to a particular place wherever that food is being produced. So the way that this sort of developed, and it's still sort of a broad concept I've been working on sussing out in different ways, but essentially looking at tropical agroforestry systems, which are the traditional cropping system throughout the tropics and many other places, and really are the birthplace of agriculture overall. And so this is a photo of a integrated agroforestry system with Gliricidia, which is a nitrogen-fixing tree used as an overstory and a trellis for black pepper and also some other ground covers. Then periodically throughout the period there are other crops interspersed. So it's providing for fertility as well as production in the same site, as opposed to having, say, high energy inputs of chemical fertilizers or pesticides that would have to be brought in from exogenous resources and possibly mined across the world. From that, worked to develop a project a couple years ago assessing a complete diet from tree crops. So this was a project I worked on looking at what would essentially a tree crop system look like in the tropics to provide for all of the dietary needs. Broadly looking at something I later sussed out in nutritive groups, which were looking essentially at fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. And so in this prior design, looking at the nutrient compounds of these different species to select for a complete diet. And this is then used as sort of an overstory skeleton along which other species are integrated within. So this was a project for my associates, I guess it was, and then later, after seeing the sort of broadly diversified forestry systems in Vanuatu while I was working down there, and realizing that they're essentially managing broad forestry systems, and so conceiving of how to sort of translate that with the concept of this complete diet from tree crops into essentially a series of different groups of species that could enable us to have consistent food production that enables or that affords human health while also being aware of the potential hazards of the site. So we roughly break this into nutritive groups, like I said, sort of broadly fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. Within each nutritive group, you'll have functional groups that are pretty much akin to different ecological functions. So we're looking at things like nitrogen fixation, pollinator attraction, different sort of climatic or spatial niches, such as whether it's shade tolerant or not. And then within each of those function groups, so say for example we have a protein producing tree that is a nitrogen fixer. So within the protein nutritive group, we then have our selection of nitrogen fixing species. Within those nitrogen fixers, we then have response diversity. So we're selecting different species that are both nitrogen fixing and fat producing, or protein producing, but that also within that function group have diversity of responses to hazards that are found on the site. So say, for example, we're in a coastal area where we may have coastal flooding, or possibly sort of may also be in a riparian zone that could have freshwater flooding, salt blow, looking at fires, pests, and other potential issues, high wind, hurricanes, and such. So essentially, this is a large amount of species that could be managed in many different ways, but you're essentially trying to fold in these various aspects of nutritive value, ecosystem function, and hazard resilient capacity. And then around each of those, around each of these, you would be building what are known as essentially guilds or selections of non-tree species to support the growth of that particular tree crop or whatever it might be. That also allow you to have an increase in dietary diversity, increase in just the general growth in the meantime. So instead of just planting this tree and waiting for 10 years for it to show up, you have this variety of support species to facilitate its growth, to attract things that will support it, whether that be you or other beneficial species, and generally help it out. So from there, in trying to figure out a way to begin processing some of this information in a useful manner, I've been looking at developing a mobile application that would facilitate species selection and analyze site data and species to give you a sort of a suggested plant list, and potentially as an add-on a few other things. So for this initial site analysis, we're really looking predominantly at your soil type, your precipitation patterns, your solar radiation, elevation, and then utilizing the tax map key boundaries and relevant hazard overlays to give a nice sort of picture of what the likely hazards are for the site, as well as what are the broad climatic considerations. So I've collected up data from the NRCS's Surgo information, which was conveniently categorized by the UC Davis Soil Resource Lab. UH has put together a wonderful rainfall atlas that has a point you can pick anywhere on a map, and it'll give you your approximated rainfall by month. Elevation would be derived from your handheld mobile device, or potentially through a Google Earth application or web app. TMKs and other hazard data such as fire, flood, tsunami, and still looking to try and track down some others were largely found at the State GIS site. So once all that information has been collected, you then get that cross-referenced with a suite of other species databases. Predominantly the one I've focused most on is a book set called Permacopoeia, written by a woman with a wonderful name, D. Hunter Beyer, and another fellow, Dr. Franklin Martin, who is a preeminent tropical subsistence agriculture guy working with the USDA for a long time in Puerto Rico. So they produced a 3-book set for Hawaii, the first book of which is all canoe plants, indigenous, endemic species that are, that really looks at how these things are utilized both in an ecosystem as well as by people. So it goes through a lot of the sort of functional interrelationships within species. The second book is focused on all sort of broad realm of introduced species, and then the third book focused on potentially weedy species. So I've connected with her. She was able or willing to share with me that data set, which is great. I've had the books for years and used them regularly, but they're unfortunately in a Word document, so I'm getting a bunch of my students to translate that into a database. Thank goodness for work trade. But there are a bunch of, so that's ideal, and it's a relatively small data set, but it is all tailored to species that are known to work locally, which is great. But there are also many other data sets that we can pull from. For example, the FAO has an eco crop, which goes into a lot more fine-grained data, such as the soil pH, porosity, and other considerations that are much more finely tuned for different species. Similarly, there's another database of about 7,000 species in Plants for a Future, which is more tailored towards temperate ones, but it does integrate something that I'm looking to potentially add on later, which is essentially, it operates in some manners as a community wiki site, so that there can be user-generated data to facilitate the database's growth. And then the World Agroforestry Species Switchboard is created by the World Agroforestry Center, which is essentially a compendium of about 13 different databases where you can enter one species name and it will pop up all of those pages with all of 13 databases and 4 other sort of lists to give you huge amounts of information. So collating all of that is something that still has to be done, but there's a lot of opportunities out there. Potential users for these types of things, particularly locally, we're looking at gardeners, farmers, conservationists, and planners, at least as a possibility. And this is something I experienced actually yesterday to some degree. I helped run a reciprocal gardening network called Permablitz Hawaii, and we were running an event, and I was out placing plants and choosing where things go, and one of the guys came up and was like, man, you must have to go to school for years to do this. And so I've recognized that over time that the sort of barrier to activity or to integration or even beginning with gardening or farming or what have you is oftentimes a sort of perceived knowledge barrier. And so having a tool that you could show up and push a button and get told about your rainfall, your soil, your radiant, your peak sun hours, and a suggested species list, I think would greatly facilitate that. In terms of conservationists, going back to this first book set, one of the initial things we've been considering is essentially releasing all of the native species aspects of it as a free application so that it's open to anyone to utilize. So that for conservationists, for sort of native plant enthusiasts and whatnot, that selecting those species would be free and open to the public. It's just essentially facilitating the use of those things, somewhat similar to what the Board of Water Supply has done on their native plant selection list. With the sort of interaction of planners, we're looking at potentially integrating with some of my other study in the program, at least, is looking at urban agriculture and facilitating species selection to really have low energy agriculture. So if we plant things that are tailored to the rainfall of the site, then we don't have to irrigate, and if we plant them in manners that are sort of utilizing of the other species around them in beneficial ways, then we're decreasing our energy overall. Future steps, really rapidly, is including some of the climate forcings models that are being produced by other parts of the university. So I've connected with another grad student at NRAM and a few of the researchers in, is that the ISP, some acronym, where they're looking at essentially what the potential rainfall shifts will be in different parts of the state. So they've completed their models for Maui, looking at both sort of 1 kilometer and 3 kilometer. And so what this will allow is essentially another overlay in the sort of filtering process of data selection. So you can look at getting species not only that will work with today's rainfall, but then also having an understanding of the species that would be more probably tailored to what the rainfall will be in the future, which will then ideally sort of increase the capacity of your planting project overall. Looking also at potentially creating layers of sort of the spatial niches of different food forestry items. So going back to the beginning when we talked about these overstory, and then also having the plant lists collated by overstory, understory species, ground covers, root crops, and essentially isolating out by different spatial niche to enhance the design that would ideally be done as a byproduct of utilizing an application like this. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that sort of wiki community database integration. And then something that I'd worked on for another class is developing this idea of distributed community forestry, which is essentially taking that broad forestry system that I mentioned in terms of having you have all of these different species with all of these different tolerances and purposes and whatnot, but most of us, especially in urban areas, do not have a back 40 acres on which to do that. We do, however, probably have some space in our yard or in our neighborhood that can be having something planted out. So connecting with other community organizations like Arbor Day and things like that to facilitate tools like this to help homeowners and select things that will be better tailored to their environments, and then ideally also feed in with ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction if we're choosing things that can also not only be tolerant to our the hazards we may face on our site, but also things that can help mitigate some of those hazards. So, yeah, that's it. Any questions?
It's a very interesting presentation on a number of levels. One thing I'm sort of drawn back to Rachel's presentation about inflection points. And so on the one hand, there are climate changes or changes in the environment. What are the political inflection points that would make a difference in terms of shifting this from the current production system, the current use of lands, to what would it take to move towards this right now?
To move towards this being more people engaged in production, what I'm one of the other bits, actually for what'll be my AOC, is looking at removing some of the zoning barriers and allowing essentially crop production, animal husbandry as a conditional use minor permit in residential and commercial areas. So that's another sort of adjunct of facilitating these things in urban areas, but that's more at a production scale, like if you're going to be a farmer. In terms of the actual barriers politically to a lot of, like the integrating or planting out these different things, it's relatively slim. It's more of just, I think, that perceived sort of knowledge barrier is larger than the state plans, barring you from having an orchard or something like that.
What do you think about those urban food forest efforts that some municipalities have started? Is that something that is consistent with this? Or? Yeah,
I've actually been involved and did the design for the Ka'aloa food forest in downtown. So that whole thing ran its course over the past year, and it's been pretty interesting. And so in terms of categorizing urban agriculture, we can sort of look at public production on public land, private production on public land, and private production on private land. And so the way in which, I think this could be applicable to all of them, but the political boundaries become much more pertinent when you're looking at public production on public land or private production on public land. When it's all on private land, it's much less of an issue, and I think crossing those boundaries is going to be a lot easier. But as I saw through my experience with the Parks and Rec department and all of that, we had $50,000 allocated in the city budget for this project, and we're still unable to get them entirely on board, despite initially them being on board, and then leadership changes and new people in office, and they, don't necessarily want to try something new when you just walked in the door. So.
It might be interesting to look at some of the cities that have been successful in implementing this and to see what it takes to sort of move it politically and to build the local.
That's exactly what my AOC is.
Oh, that sounds good.
Yeah, cool.
I have a couple of, I've been looking at wildfire planning policy, meaning looking at where and how our future growth occurs in respect to wildfire risk and the different planning and regulatory tools that can be used. But often our land use and planning agencies have not focused on wildfire risk. It has been within the Department of Land and Natural Resources. It has been in our fire departments and nonprofits. And exactly, how do you get all these people together? And what I've seen in some examples is a working group that involves, a wide variety of interdisciplinary agencies. But also working at the legislature, there has been legislative mandated task forces that have approached these issues, and I think that could possibly, in both of these instances be applied. But it's just two things, but then you can also go, it's always policy, like how do you drive policy? And so I find it really interesting. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that.
That'd be great.
There may have been a lesson embedded in Robbins as well, too, in terms of strong leadership at the local level or at the state levels for introducing these programs. But anyway, good person.
Good job.